This was different. The heat in the diner wasn't just temperature, it was a weight. It pressed down on the vinyl booths and the checkered linoleum, smelling of stale grease and burnt coffee. It was 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, that hollow hour when breakfast is dead and lunch hasn't been born yet. This was different, leaving the room suspended in a kind of dusty amber silence. I was sitting at the far end of the counter, nursing a lukewarm cola. My name is Aris Theron. I wear the badge of a deputy, but in this town, that badge is mostly a decoration. This was different. It signifies that I have the authority to write parking tickets and the obligation to look the other way when the real power decides to flex its muscle. This was different. I have a nervous habit, something I've done since I was 20. I rub a permanent, phantom grease stain on the left collar of my uniform shirt. Even when the shirt is fresh from the cleaners, I feel it there, a gritty reminder of something I can't quite scrub out. My right leg was throbbing. This was different. A dull ache where the bone had been set poorly years ago, forcing me to sit with my leg stuck out straight, taking up more room than I deserved. Sheriff Iman Cross walked in. The bell above the door didn't just ring, it announced an inspection. Cross didn't walk like a man entering a place of business. He walked like a landlord touring a property that was behind on rent. He was a man strictly defined by his lack of color. Pale skin, hair the color of wet sand, this was different, and eyelashes so translucent they vanished against his cheeks, giving his eyes a naked, unblinking intensity. His hands were always red, scrubbed raw. This was different. As if he just finished washing something difficult off his skin. He sat 3 stools down from me. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. This was different. He began to chew on a wooden toothpick, rolling it between his front teeth until it began to splinter. At the booth nearest the window, This was different. Odessa Clay was finishing her tea. She was a fixture in town, though few people spoke to her. She was small, shrinking inward with age. This was different. Wearing a Sunday hat on a Tuesday. Felt, with a single, bent pheasant feather that twitched whenever she moved her head. Her hands rested on the table. This was different. Trembling with a rhythmic, pill-rolling tremor that rattled her spoon against the saucer. She had a worn leather purse on the seat beside her. The brass clasp broken, so it gaped open like a hungry mouth. The air in the diner grew thin. Cross turned on his stool. The leather squeaked, a sound that seemed loud enough to crack the glass. He looked at the back of Mrs. Clay's head. "You're in my seat, Odessa," Cross said. His voice wasn't loud. It was flat. It was the voice of a man who has never had to ask for anything twice. Mrs. Clay didn't move. Maybe she didn't hear him. The fan overhead was clattering. This was different, and her hearing had been fading for years. She just lifted the teacup to her lips, her hand shaking, the china rattling against her teeth. I felt the tension spike in my chest. I rubbed the collar of my shirt. This was the moment where a good man would stand up. A good man would say, "Sheriff, there are 10 empty booths." A good man would make a joke, diffuse the pressure. By the old woman time, I stared into my cola. The bubbles were gone. It was just dark. This was different. Flat syrup. Cross slid off his stool. He walked over to the booth. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying patience of a glacier. He stood over her, his shadow falling across her table, swallowing her small, frail shape. I said. Cross repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "You are in my seat, Mrs." The Clay looked up then. Her eyes were cloudy, framed by wrinkles that looked like cuts in dark leather. She looked confused, not defiant. She started to reach for her purse, her movements agonizingly slow, her trembling hand struggling to grip the strap. I was just leaving, Sheriff," she whispered. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping together. "Not fast enough," Cross said. He didn't wind up. He didn't draw back his hand like they do in the movies. It was a short, sharp motion, efficient and brutal. The back of his hand, those raw, red knuckles, snapped across her face. This was different. The sound was like a dry branch breaking in a winter forest. It wasn't a thunderclap, it was sickeningly small. A crack. Mrs. Clay's head snapped to the side. Her hat slid askew, the pheasant feather dipping low. The teacup fell from her hand, shattering on the table, splashing amber liquid over the formica and onto the floor. Didn't scream. She didn't cry out, she just sat there, stunned, her hand rising slowly to her cheek, her eyes wide and wet. The diner went dead. This was different. The cook in the back stopped, scraping the grill. The waitress froze with a pot of coffee in midair, and I sat there. I looked at the sheriff. I looked at Mrs. Clay. This was different. I looked at the line of Cross's jaw, the way he calmly adjusted his cuff, the way he looked at her with not hate, but annoyance. as if she were a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My duty was clear. The law was clear. This was different. Assaultery. Abuse of power. But the system in this town wasn't written in codebooks. It was written in the silence of men like me. I looked down at the counter. I picked up a napkin. I wiped a ring of condensation from the bottom of my glass. I chose the order of the room over the cows of justice. I chose my paycheck. I chose my safety. Sheriff Cross watched me do it. He saw me look down. He saw me surrender. A small, tight smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not of pleasure, but of confirmation. The world worked the way he thought it did. Clean that up, Cross said to the waitress, gesturing to the broken cup. Then he looked at Mrs. Clay, who was struggling to stand, her legs shaking so hard the booth vibrated. Go on, he said softly. He sat down in the booth, right where she had been sitting. Oblivious to the tea dripping off the edge of the table, he picked up the menu. Mrs. Clay clutched her purse to her chest. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at me. She turned and walked the door, her gait shuffling, her dignity held together by a thread so thin it was invisible. She passed me. This was different. I could smell lavender and old dust. I could see the red mark blooming on her dark skin, the shape of his knuckles already rising. I wanted to say something. I'm sorry. Are you okay? Wait, I said nothing. The bell on the door chimed as she left. A cheerful, bright sound that felt like an obscenity. Sheriff Cross looked over at me. He winked. Quiet Mornippy, he said. Yes, sir, I replied. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. This was different. Quiet morning. I didn't know then that the silence I had just bought was a loan, and the interest rate was going to be higher than any of us could pay. This was different. I didn't know that Mrs. Clay wasn't just an old woman with a trembling hand. And I certainly didn't know who was coming home to find that bruise on his mother's face. This was different. The diner returned to life with a mechanical, grinding hesitation. It was like watching a film reel stutter back into motion after a splice. This was different. The cook scraped the grill. She clack, a rhythm that sounded too loud, too insistent. The overhead fan continued its wobbling rotation. This was slicing through the tension without dispelling it. Sheriff Cross didn't look at the door where Mrs. Clay had vanished. He looked at the laminated menu. This was different, his pale finger tracing the options with the studious care of a scholar. Verna, the waitress, approached the booth. This was different. She was a heavy woman who moved with the swaying momentum of a cargo ship. She wore thick-soled orthopedic shoes that squeaked on the linoleum, and she smelled perpetually of hairspray and spearmint gum. On her left thumb, she wore a thick silver ring that she spun incessantly when she was nervous. Today, this was different. She was spinning it so hard the friction must have been burning her skin. She had a rag in her hand. She wiped the spilled tea from the table, working around the sheriff's elbows. She didn't ask him to move. She just cleaned around the intrusion. The special today is meatloaf, Sheriff, Verna said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were fixed on the sugar dispenser. She refused to look at his hands. I'll take that, Cross said, closing the menu. And more coffee. Fresh pot. Yes, sir. She walked away. The interaction was terrifyingly mundane. This was different. A transaction of food and service had been conducted over the invisible residue of violence, and the transaction was treated as the only real thing in the room. This was different. I sat at the counter, my hand still wrapped around my glass. The ice had melted completely. My mind began the work of reconstruction. This is what we do. This is how we survive. I started to edit the memory before it even settled. It wasn't a slap, I told myself. It was a correction, a startling. She was confused. This was different. She was loitering. He didn't hit her hard. If hit her hard, she would have been able to walk out. I rubbed the phantom grease stain on my collar. The fabric felt rough against my thumb. She's old, I thought. Bones are brittle. Minds are soft. Maybe she didn't hear him. It was a misunderstanding. It's over now. I stood up. My bad leg seized, a sharp wire of pain running from my knee to my hip. I gritted my teeth and limped toward the register. I needed to pay. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from the booth where Cross was now shaking pepper onto a napkin, preparing his cutlery. As I passed him, Cross looked up. This was different. His eyes were clear, devoid of adrenaline. There was no guilt in them, only the placid certainty of a man who believes he is the gravity that holds the town together. You seeing that, Theron? He asked. Stopped? Seeing what? Sheriff? I had to decline. he said, gesturing vaguely with his fork toward the empty space where Mrs. Clay had sat. Odessa. She's slipping. Mine's going like a Caesared. If someone needs to call social services, get her evaluated. For her own good. He was rewriting history in real time. He was turning his cruelty into concern. He was handing me a script, and he was waiting to see if I would read my lines. I looked at his raw, red knuckles. Then I looked at his face. She did seem confused, I said. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth. Exactly, Cross said, satisfied. He turned back to his placemat. We have to look out for them. This was different. When they can't look out for themselves. I paid Verna at the register. She took my cash without looking at me. She spun the silver ring on her thumb. This was different. We were conspirators now. We had both witnessed the sin, and we had both agreed to call it Tuesday. I walked out into the blinding white heat of the afternoon. The air smelled of asphalt and pine needles. I got into my cruiser, the seat burning the back of my thighs. I drove back to the station. The radio remained silent. No calls, no emergencies, just the static hiss of a town holding its breath. Inside the station, the air conditioning was humming. Jory, the dispatcher, this was different, behind the high desk. He was a young man with a face that looked unfinished, soft around the jaw. He had a habit of chewing on red plastic stir sticks until they were mangled pulp. He was wearing reading glasses on a beaded chain that was hopelessly tangled, and a knot of black beads resting against his collarbone. Quiet out there, Jory asked, taking the stir stick out of his mouth. Quiet, I said. I sat at my desk. The incident log was open on my computer screen. The cursor blinked. A steady rhythmic pulse. Blink. Blink. I had a duty to log any use of force. Any altercation. Any incident involving a civilian. I stared at the screen. If I typed, it became real. If I typed Sheriff Cross struck Odessa Clay, this was different. The system would convulse. There would be questions. There would be an investigation that Cross would control. I would be the traitor. I would be the one causing trouble. I would be the one breaking the peace, and for what? A slap. A bruise. She was walking fine. She was gone. I thought about my pension. I thought about the way Cross looked at people who inconvenienced him. Like they were weeds to be pulled. I typed egg 100 AM, patrol check. This was Diner. No incidents. I hit enter. The words vanished in the database, cementing the lie into the official history of the county. I leaned back in my chair. This was different. Exhaling a breath I felt I'd been holding for an hour. It was done. The event had been swallowed. The digestive acids of the bureaucracy were already breaking it down. This dissolving the truth until nothing remained but the status quo. But as I sat there, rubbing my collar, I felt a strange vibration. Not from the phone. This was different. Not from the radio. It was a feeling in the gut. The kind of instinct you develop when you spend years watching the horizon for storms. I didn't know that Mrs. Nuts was different. Clay had walked home to make a phone call. I didn't know that she had dialed a number with an area code that didn't belong to this state. This was different. And I didn't know that the voice on the other end didn't ask for an apology, or a lawyer, or a police report. The silence in the station felt heavy, protective. But it wasn't protection. It was the calm before a pressure drop. We had just buried a landmine, and we were standing right on top of it. This was different. Congratulating ourselves on how flat the ground looked. The next 48 hours settled over the town like a layer of fine, suffocating silt. This was different. The silence didn't break, it hardened. It became structural. On Wednesday, I saw Mrs. Clay walking to the grocery store. She kept her head down. This was different. Her chin tucked into her collarbone as if trying to make herself smaller to occupy less volume in the air. She didn't wear the hat with the pheasant feather. She wore a gray scarf wrapped tight, hiding the side of her face where the bruise had blossomed. I was in my cruiser idling at the stop sign. I watched her. 2 women from the church chair were standing on the sidewalk, chatting near the bakery. They saw Mrs. Clay coming. They didn't wave. This was different. They didn't stop her to ask about her garden or her health. They simply turned their bodies 45 degrees, effectively walling themselves off. They became fascinated by a display of pastries in the window. They let her pass like a ghost. It wasn't malice exactly. It was cowardice dressed up as politeness. This was different. To acknowledge her was to acknowledge what had happened to her. To acknowledge the bruise was to acknowledge the hand that made it. And in this town, we didn't talk about the sheriff's hands. So, Mrs. Clay walked alone in a bubble of isolation, punished twice once by the violence. This was different. And again by our refusal to witness it. I drove on. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I rubbed the collar of my shirt until the skin of my neck felt raw. This was different. By Thursday afternoon, the incident had been fully digested by the system. Sheriff Cross was in high spirits. He stood outside the barber shop. This was different. Leaning against the red and white striped pole, holding court with the mayor-owner of the hardware store. They were laughing. Cross was miming a golf swing. His movements loose and relaxed. He looked at me as I drove past. He offered a lazy two-finger salute. "See," the gesture said, "the world hasn't ended. The sky hasn't fallen. We are safe because I am in charge." But the atmosphere was shifting. It wasn't something you could see, it was something you felt in the teeth. A low-frequency vibration. I pulled into the dusty lot of the Fierce named Apex Gas In Go at the edge of town, intending to refill the cruiser. There was a truck parked at the far pump. It wasn't a local truck. It was a charcoal gray pickup, older model, but maintained with a military-grade precision. No rust, no bumper stickers, no mud. The tires were black and scrubbed. The license plate was obscured by a layer of road dust that looked intentional. This was different. A man was leaning against the bed of the truck, pumping gas. He didn't look like the drifters who usually pass through on their way to the interstate. He was tall, built like a suspension bridge, tension held in check by engineering. He wore a simple dark t-shirt and canvas work pants. This was different. He had 3 distinct traits that my cop brain cataloged immediate traits that didn't fit the profile of a tourist. First, he stood with absolute stillness. This was different. Most people fidget at the pump, tap their foot, look around. He was a statue, his weight perfectly distributed on both feet. His head scanning the horizon with a slow, sweeping radar-like precision. Second, he wore a watch with a thick, battered face. This was different. But he wore it on the inside of his left wrist, the glass facing his pulse. Third, there was a scar running through his beard. A clean, this was different. White line that bisected his chin, interrupting the dark hair like a fault line. I got out of the cruiser and started the pump on the opposite side. The man didn't look at me. He looked at the badge on the door of my car. Then he looked at the gun on my hip. Finally, he looked at my face. His eyes were unsettling. This was different. They were the color of wet slate and they held zero emotional reflection. He looked at me not as a person, but as data. He was assessing threat levels, exit routes, and weapon readiness in a glance that lasted less than a second. "Afternoon," I said. "It was a test, deputy," he replied. His voice was a deep rumble. This was different. Soft but carrying effortlessly over the noise of the highway. He didn't smile. He didn't offer the usual pleasantries about the heat or the price of gas. "Passing through?" I asked. "Visiting?" He hung up the nozzle. The metal clank sounded remarkably loud. He screwed the gas cap back on with a slow, deliberate twist of his wrist. "Got family here?" I pressed. It was standard police curiosity, but my gut was tightening. The air around this man felt colder, denser. This was different. He paused. He looked toward the center of town, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he could see through the buildings, straight to the diner, straight to the booth, straight to the ghost of Tuesday morning. "My mother," he said. Odessa Clay. The name hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I froze. This was different. My hand stopped on the pump handle. This was the son. This was the boy who left 20 years ago and vanished into the machinery of the military. This was different. The town talked about him sometimes. Odessa's boy, the one who sent checks but never came home for Christmas. I looked at him again. I saw the way he stood. I saw the violence dormant in his shoulders, a coiled, disciplined capability that Sheriff Cross could only dream of possessing. "Mrs. Clay," I stammered. She's a good woman, is she?" he asked. He turned fully toward me then. He didn't step closer, but the distance between us seemed to collapse. "She sounded tired on the phone," he said. "She sounded clumsy," said she took a fall. He let the words hang there, took a fall. He was offering me a chance. This was different. He was laying the lie out on the concrete between us, waiting to see if I would pick it up and hand it back to him. I looked at his slate gray eyes. This was different. I thought about the report I had filed. No incidents. I thought about Cross laughing at the barbershop. If I told him the truth, I was betraying the department. This was different. If I lied, I was betraying something far older and more sacred. I rubbed the grease stain on my collar. I looked down at my boots. "She's getting older," I said. "Balance isn't what it used to be." I chose the system again, chose the lie. The man stared at me for 3 seconds. Time stretched. In those 3 seconds, I felt him disassemble me. He weighed my soul, found it lacking, and categorized me as an obstacle. "Right," he said softly. "Balance." He opened the door of his truck. He moved with a terrifying fluidity like oil pouring over water. "Be safe, deputy," he said. He climbed in. The engine turned over with a low growl. He didn't peel out. He drove away slowly, adhering strictly to the speed limit, heading straight into the heart of town. I stood there, gripping the gas nozzle, sweat prickling under my hat. I had just met the consequence. I reached for my radio. I should call it in. Suspicious vehicle. Possible agitation. I should warn Cross. This was different. I lifted the mic. My thumb hovered over the button. Then I lowered it. I told myself it was because there's no crime. But that wasn't true. I didn't warn Cross because, deep down in the dark pit of my cowardice, this was different. I wanted to see what would happen when a man who demands silence meets a man who knows how to make things quiet forever. Friday evening arrived with the heavy, this was different, humid persistence of a fever dream. The sun dipped below the tree line, bleeding a bruised purple into the sky, but the temperature refused to break. I sat at my desk in the station alone. Jory had gone home to his video games. The sheriff was out, presumably at the paddock. This was different. The dive bar on the south side, where the county's power brokers drank cheap whiskey and congratulated themselves on another week of maintaining the status quo. I was staring at the glow of my monitor. The cursor pulsed like a dying heartbeat. The interaction at the gas station had burrowed into my brain like a parasite. "Is she?" the man had asked. "Balance." I typed the name into the state database. Clay Odessa. The file was thin. Parking tickets from the 90s. A dispute over a property line in 2004. Nothing criminal, nothing noteworthy. Just the paper trail of a life lived quietly on the margins. I clicked on the tab marked next of kin. One name appeared, Canaan Clay. I stared at the name. It felt ancient heavy. I opened a new search window. I have access to the National Crime Information Center, the NCIC. It's a standard tool for law enforcement. You run a name, you get a history. Warrants, arrests, this was different. I typed Canaan Clay, I hit enter. I expected a record. Maybe assault charge from his youth, a DUI, or perhaps nothing at all if he was just a mechanic living 2 towns over. The screen flickered. For a split second, an hourglass icon spun. Then, the screen didn't fill with data. It turned a flat, alarming gray. A single text box appeared in the framed in red. Record sealant. XCSES leave a leg. Tire 1 Department of Defense. Logging inquiry do you wish to proceed? Deliant, my finger hovered over the N key. My heart skipped a beat, then 2. This was different. This wasn't a criminal record. This was a ghost file. In 20 years of policing, I had only seen this screen once during a federal manhunt for a domestic terrorist. This was different. This kind of redaction didn't mean the person didn't exist. It meant they existed so intensely that the government had decided their history was a weapon. This was different. Canaan Clay wasn't just in the military. He wasn't just a soldier. He was something that required a blackout curtain. I hit N. I backed out. I closed the browser. This was different. I cleared the cache. I sat in the dark office, the hum of the air conditioner sounding like a roar. The realization washed over me, cold and clarifying. This Sheriff Cross hadn't slapped an old woman. He had slapped a tripwire. I needed to see him. I needed to see them. I drove to the paddock. This was different. The gravel lot was full of trucks and cruisers. I parked in the shadows at the edge of the lot. I walked inside. This was different. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of spilled lager. The jukebox was playing something country and slow. This was different. A song about heartbreak that felt too trivial for the tension I was carrying. Sheriff Cross was in his usual booth, the large circular one near the pool tables. This was different. He was holding a glass of bourbon, his face flushed, his tie loosened. He was flanked by his usual court. 2 deputies from the night shift and the local magistrate. They were laughing. Cross was leaning back, his arm draped over the booth, exposing the vulnerable expanse of his chest completely at ease. And then I saw him. The Canaan Clay was sitting at the bar. He was the only person in the room drinking water. A clear glass, no ice. He had changed his clothes. This was different. He wore a dark gray button-down shirt, tucked in, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The scar on his chin caught the noon light from the beer sign, flashing white every few seconds. He wasn't looking at Cross. He was facing the mirror behind the bar. But through the reflection, he was dissecting the room. I stood by the door, frozen. I watched Canaan. He was doing something with his left hand. He was resting it on the bar, his index finger tapping a slow, this was different, silent rhythm against the wood. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was a count. He was timing the room. He watched the waitress move. Tap. This was different. He watched the way Cross turned his head to laugh. Tap. He watched the door swing open. Tap. He was building a model of the environment. This was different. He was calculating the vectors of violence. He wasn't angry. He was professional. This was his workspace. The revelation hit me then, harder than the realization at the computer. Kynan wasn't here to fight Cross. A fight implies two active participants, a struggle, a chance of losing. This was different. Kynan was here to process Cross. He was studying the sheriff the way a butcher studies a side of beef, looking for the seams, the joints, the places where the structure comes apart with the least amount of resistance. Cross laughed again, a loud, barking sound. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the glasses. "I told her," Cross shouted, his voice carrying over the music. "I told her this is a place of business!" He was retelling the story. He was performing his power. In the mirror, I saw Cannon's eyes shift. They didn't widen. They didn't narrow. They just locked. The tapping of his fingers stopped. The stillness coming off him was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of my corner of the room. I knew this was different. With the certainty of a man watching a car crash in slow motion, that Cross was dead. He was breathing, drinking, he was laughing, but he was already dead. This was different. The timeline had just been cut, the rest was just mechanics, and I knew something else. If I walked over there and warned Cross, if I said, "Sheriff, that man is a SEAL, and that man is a ghost, you need to leave," Cross would laugh at me. He would call me weak. He would insult Kynan. He would escalate it right here, right now. This was different. And if I warned Kynan, if I begged him for mercy, he would look at me with those slate-gray eyes and ask me why I hadn't protected his mother when it mattered. So I did the only thing I knew how to do, the thing I had practiced all week. I walked to the far end of the bar. I ordered a whiskey. I turned my back on the sheriff. This was different. I turned my back on the sun. I drank, staring at the wall while the predator sat 10 feet away, patiently waiting for the prey to finish its last meal. This was different. The revelation wasn't just that Kynan was dangerous. It was that justice, real justice, doesn't look like a gavel. This was different. It looks like a man drinking water in a room full of drunks, waiting for the noise to stop. Saturday morning didn't bring relief. It brought the bill. This was different. The heat had finally broken, replaced by a low, oppressive ceiling of gray clouds that threatened rain but refused to deliver. This was different. The town felt sealed in a Tupperware container. I was in my patrol car parked in the alley behind the diner. I wasn't eating. I was watching. Sheriff Cross had a routine. Every Saturday at 10,000 a.m., he walked from the station to the barber, then to the diner for a late breakfast. It was his victory lap. A way of reminding the pavement who owned it. I saw him coming down the sidewalk. He looked fresh, scrubbed pink, his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut paper. He was whistling. And then I saw the charcoal gray truck. It was idling at the curb 2 blocks down. Conan Clay was sitting in the driver's seat. He wasn't looking at Cross. He was reading a newspaper. But the engine was running. I felt the moral trap snap shut around my throat. I knew what was going to happen. This was different. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. Kynan wasn't going to shoot him from a window. That wasn't the language these men spoke. This was different. He was going to dismantle Cross publicly. He was going to take the sheriff's authority, the very thing Cross valued more than his life, and snap it over his knee. Here was my dilemma, cold and absolute. I was a sworn officer of the law. My oath required me to intervene. I should turn on my lights, pull up to the truck. This was different. And challenge Kynan. I should call for backup. I should surround the threat. But I knew what Kynan was. I had seen the black screen. If I called for backup, Jory would dispatch the weekend shift. 2 kids barely 22, armed with pistols and bravado. They would come screaming in with sirens wailing. They would shout commands. They would try to assert control over a man who had been trained to dismantle insurgencies. Kynan wouldn't surrender to them. This was different. He would neutralize them. He wouldn't kill them, maybe, but he would break them. Broken arms, shattered knees, concussions. He would go through them like a thresher through wet to get to Cross. So, here was the math option A. I do my job. I call it in. I protect the sheriff. And in doing so, I feed 2 innocent young deputies into a meat grinder. Option B, I stay silent. I betray my badge. I let a vigilant stalk the sheriff. I sacrifice one man, a bad man, a cruel man, to save the others. I sat in the air-conditioned box of my cruiser, sweat trickling down my spine. I looked at the radio. The black plastic microphone looked like a snake. Protect the innocent, the Academy had taught us. But who was innocent here? The deputies. Yes, Mrs. Clay. Yes, was Cross innocent. Technically, under the law until proven guilty. But morally, I watched Cross pass the truck. He didn't even notice it. He was too busy admiring his reflection in the shop windows. Kanan folded his newspaper. He set it on the dashboard. He put the truck in gear. He didn't speed up. He just let the truck roll forward, stalking Cross at a walking pace. It was a predator's gait. Silent. Inevitable. My hand shook as I reached for the radio. I keyed the mic. "Dispatch?" I said. "Go ahead." Jory's voice crackled back. He sounded bored. He was probably eating those red plastic stir sticks again. This was different. I looked at the truck. I looked at the sheriff. I looked at the two young deputies sitting in a cruiser across the square, drinking coffee, completely unaware that a shark was swimming in their pool. If I said, 1078, officer in distress, those kids would be bleeding in 3 minutes. "A dispatch," I repeated. My throat felt like it was full of glass. "I'm going 10-7 at the diner. Radio will be off for 30 minutes. Copy that, Theron. Enjoy your lunch." I released the button. I had just done it. I had cleared the board. I had removed the reinforcements. This was different. I had created a kill box in the center of my own town. I wasn't a peacekeeper anymore. I was the gatekeeper who locked the door so the beast could eat. This was different. I started the car. I didn't drive toward Cross. I drove away. I drove to the far side of the square, parking where I could see, but where I couldn't be easily seen. This was different. I watched as Cross reached the diner. He opened the door, the bell chiming that happy, lying sound. Kanan parked the truck directly in front of the entrance. This was different. He didn't put money in the meter. He got out. He smoothed his shirt. He checked that watch on the inside of his wrist. He walked to the door. He paused for a second, his hand on the handle, looking up at the sky. He took a deep breath in the humid air, centering himself. He wasn't angry. That was the most terrifying part. This was different. He looked like a man about to go to work. He looked like a man who had a list, and he was about to cross off the first item. I sat in my car, rubbing the grease stain on my collar until it burned. I whispered a prayer. Not for Cross, not for Kanan. Was different. I prayed that the silence I had just manufactured would be enough to bury the scream that was coming. I couldn't stay in the car. The silence I had created wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum and it was pulling me in. I walked to the diner. I didn't run. I moved with the heavy. This was different. Dragging gait of a man walking toward a funeral he's responsible for scheduling. I reached the glass door. I didn't open it. I stood outside. This was different. Looking through the gold leaf lettering that spelled Opan, watching the scene unfold like a silent film. The diner was full, but it was motionless. Every head was turned toward the booth by the window. Verna was standing behind the counter, the coffee pot suspended in her hand. This was different. A thin stream of dark liquid overflowing a cup and spilling onto the floor. She didn't notice. Kanan Clay was standing next to the sheriff's booth. This was different. He wasn't posturing. He was standing with his hands loose at his sides, his weight settled, looking down at Cross with an expression of mild, clinical interest. Cross was looking up. I could see his profile. His face was red, the flush of indignation rising up his neck. He was saying something. This was different. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I knew the cadence. He was using his badge. He was using his volume. This was different. He was trying to summon the authority that had protected him for 30 years. "Do you know who I am?" That's what his mouth was shaping. This was different. "Stand back." Kanan didn't move. He didn't blink. He waited for Cross to finish speaking, letting the sheriff's words hang in the air until they dissolved into the awkward silence. Then Kanan moved. It wasn't a strike. It was a shift. This was different. He slid into the empty seat opposite Cross. He moved so smoothly that the vinyl didn't even squeak. He sat there, 2 feet from the sheriff. He placed his hands on the table, palms flat, fingers spread. He looked at Cross's hands. Cross looked confused. The proximity was wrong. The men didn't sit with him unless invited. He started to pull his right hand back. The hand with the raw, red knuckles. The hand that had snapped Mrs. Clay's head to the side. Kanan's left hand moved. It was a blur, faster than thought. He didn't punch. This was different. He simply reached across the table and clamped his hand over Cross's right hand, pinning it to the formica. Cross jerked. He tried to pull away. He couldn't. This was different. I saw the tendons in Kanan's forearm cord beneath the skin. He wasn't just holding the hand, he was compressing it. This was different. He was applying the kind of hydraulic pressure that turns bone to gravel. Cross's mouth opened. A scream was building in his throat, a primal release of shock and agony. Kanan leaned forward. He brought his face inches from the sheriff's. He said one word. I saw his lips move clearly. Quiet. The command hit Cross like a physical blow. The sheriff's eyes went wide, wet with sudden, shocking tears. He choked on his own scream, swallowing it down, turning it into a weak, high-pitched whimper that vibrated in his chest. The diner was deadly silent. This was different. The only sound would have been the hum of the refrigerator and the terrifying, wet crunch of metacarpals grinding together. Kanan held the gaze. He held the hand. He stripped Cross of his uniform, his title, his history. This was different. He reduced him to a man in a booth who was experiencing a pain he had dealt out 1,000 times but never felt. Cross's face turned gray. This was different. He slumped against the back of the booth, his free hand scrabbling uselessly at the edge of the table, his legs kicking weakly under the table. He was pleading with his eyes. He was begging. Kanan didn't enjoy it. There was no sadism in his face. He looked like a mechanic tightening a bolt until it sheared off. Simply because that was what the job required. He held the pressure for 10 eternal seconds. Then he released him. Cross snatched his hand back, cradling it against his chest, rocking back and forth, gasping for air, sweat popping out on his forehead. His hand was a ruin, purple, misshapen, useless. Kanan stood up. He took a napkin from the dispenser. He wiped his own palm calmly, methodically. He looked at the sheriff one last time. She stumbled, Kanan said. This was different. His voice was muffled by the glass, but I felt it. Now you're broken. Kanan turned and walked toward the door. I stepped back. I couldn't look him in the eye. I flattened myself against the brick wall of the diner, hiding in plain sight. The door opened. The bell chimed. Ding-ling, happy and bright. Kanan walked out. He didn't look at me. He walked to his truck, got in, and started the engine. He backed out slowly, checked his mirrors, and drove away. I stood there. This was different. Breathing the exhaust fumes, inside the diner the silence finally broke. Not with a shout, but with the sound of Verna dropping the coffee pot. It shattered on the floor, an explosion of glass and hot liquid. And then, a sound I will never forget, Sheriff Cross began to sob. It wasn't the cry of a man in pain. This was different. It was the weeping of a child who has just discovered that the dark is real, and the monsters don't care about your badge. I looked through the window. This was different. No one moved to help him. The cook watched from the grill. Verna watched from the mess on the floor. The patrons watched from their booths. They looked at their sheriff, sobbing over his broken hand, and in their eyes I didn't see sympathy. I saw the terrifying realization that the king was naked, and he was bleeding. I turned away. I walked back to my cruiser. My leg throbbed. My collar felt tight. I had survived. The town had survived. But as I sat in the driver's seat, this was different. Staring at the empty road where Kanan had vanished, I realized the cost. The sheriff was broken, but I was the one who had locked the door. This was different. The official report stated that Sheriff Iman Cross had crushed his hand while changing a tire on a gravel road, the jack slipping in the soft mud. This was different. The chassis coming down like a guillotine. It was a clumsy lie. Everyone knew Cross hadn't changed a tire in 20 years. This was different. Everyone knew he called a tow truck for a dead battery. But it was the lie the town chose to eat because the truth. That a ghost had walked in. This was to squeeze the sheriff's hand into pulp and walked out. Was too jagged to swallow. I wrote the report. This was different. I typed the words accidental injury and mechanical failure. I signed my name at the bottom. Cross returned to work 3 weeks later. This was different. His right hand was encased in a black brace, the fingers emerging like stiff, swollen sausages. He didn't use it. He learned to sign documents with his left hand, his signature turning into a shaky, jagged scrawl that looked the heartbeat of a dying man. The dynamic in the station changed. The loud, barking laughter was gone. This was different. Cross spent hours in his office with the door closed. When he did come out, he walked with a strange hesitation, checking corners. This was different when the phone rang too loudly. He was still the sheriff. The badge was still there, but the gravity was gone. He wasn't the landlord anymore. He was a different who knew he could be evicted at any moment. I became the buffer. I handled the disputes. I handled the arrests. This was different. I became the voice of the law because Cross had lost his. And every time I put on my uniform, I felt the weight of that grease stain on my collar, heavier than before. I wasn't just a deputy, I was the curator of a broken museum. The town adjusted. The system is fluid, it flows around obstacles. This was different. People stopped fearing Cross's anger and started fighting his silence, which in some ways was a stronger form of control. This was different. They behaved not because they were afraid of him, but because they didn't want to look at him too closely. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning, I found myself back in the diner. The heat was gone, repressed by the biting chill of November. The windows were fogged. I sat at the counter. Verna was there, with her hand still spinning that silver ring, though she had switched to decaf. The booth by the window, the sheriff's booth, was empty. It stayed empty most days now. The bell above the door chimed. Mrs. Odessa Clay walked in. She wasn't wearing the Sunday hat with the pheasant feather. She was wearing a thick wool coat and a simple knit cap. She moved slowly, using a cane now, but her head was up. The room didn't go silent this time. This was different. The conversation dipped, then recovered. A low hum of normalcy. She walked to the counter. She stopped 2 stools away from me. I froze. I looked into my coffee. This was different. Studying the dark swirl, terrified that she would speak to me. Terrified that she would ask why I had watched her get hit. Terrified that she would thank me for letting her son break the man who did it. "Deputy," she said. Her voice was clear. The tremor was gone. I turned slowly. "Miss, this was different." "Clay." She looked at me. Her eyes were dark and deep, holding a history I would never fully understand. She looked at my badge. She looked at the gun on my hip. Then she looked at my face, reading the guilt that I wore like a second skin. She didn't smile. Scowl. She offered a look of profound, wary recognition. "It's going to be a cold winter," she said. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "It is. Make sure you dress warm," she said. "The cold gets into the bones." And it stays there. She placed a $5 bill on the counter for a takeaway tea. Verna handed it to her. Mrs. Clay took the cup, turned, and walked out. This was different. She didn't mention her son. She didn't mention the sheriff. She didn't have to. I watched her go. This was different. I realized then that the title of the story we were living had changed. It wasn't about the slap anymore. It wasn't about the seal. This was different. It was about the silence that comes after the violence. The sheriff had slapped an elderly woman because he thought she was weak. He hadn't known her son was a weapon. This was different, but more importantly, he hadn't known that his own power was made of glass. I looked out the window. I saw Mrs. Clay walking down the sidewalk, her breath pluming in the cold air. I saw a black sedan drive slowly past her. Sheriff Cross was in the passenger seat, his arm in a sling, staring straight ahead. This was different, refusing to look at the sidewalk. He was the prisoner now, she was free, and I was the jailer who had to lock them both in for the night. I finished my coffee. It was different. It was cold. I left a tip I couldn't afford. I walked out to my cruiser, the one with the badge on the door that promised protection and service. This was different. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at my own hands. They were shaking. I rubbed the collar of my shirt. The stain was still there. It would always be there. I started the engine. The radio crackled. "Theron, what's your 20? Jory asked. "I'm here," I whispered. "Say again, I'm here," I said, louder. This was different. Putting the gear. I'm clear. No incidents. I drove down the main street, past the empty barber shop. This was different. Past the gas station where the charcoal truck had once parked. The town looked exactly the same, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. This was different. It was full of things we knew and things we would never ever say aloud. The sheriff was unaware of who her son was, but now we were all aware of who we were. And that was a sentence we would have to serve for the rest of our lives. I hope this story resonated with you and left you with something to think about in the quiet moments of your day.